So after having 2 weeks worth of 2-week Masters, going into the US Open series, of course, the US Open starting in a week's time, let's have a look at the rankings because we've had some big changes and some important changes ahead of the US Open. But let's have a look at the results as well for last week in Cincinnati. So we had 2 big finals, starting with the ladies' final. Swiatek, she beat Paolini in the final 7-5, 6-4, which was a very important win, as we'll find out in the rankings in a second. And over on the men's side, we had Alcaraz beating Sinner in the final, 5-love retirement. Unfortunately, Sinner wasn't feeling well and tried to play the match, but just couldn't be competitive and wasn't feeling well enough to complete it. So Alcaraz got the Cincinnati title and also got a boost in his points to close the gap between him and Sinner at the top of the tree. Let's have a look at the players that went up in the rankings this week because we had some big results and some important results, of course, ahead of a Grand Slam. Started with Kudermetova. She went up 10 spots into the number 26 spot after making the semi-finals, which means that she will now be seeded at the US Open, so that was a big boost for her. Raducanu, she went up 4 spots to 35 in the world. Unfortunately, just missed out on being seeded, but if somebody does withdraw from the US Open that's ahead of her in the rankings, she will be seeded, so it could be a really important boost. And Krejcikova, she went up 19 spots, number 61 in the world after having a really good week in Cincinnati and is slowly getting back up the rankings after dropping a lot of points from losing Wimbledon. So, some very important boosts in the rankings there. Players that dropped down in the rankings, but also she dropped down 4 spots to 16 in the world. Of course, not playing the US Open either, so her ranking might continue to drop. Fernandez, she dropped 7 spots, number 33 in the world, which keeps her in the seeds, but really dangerously close to not being seeded. So, a lot of points lost there. And Pavlyuchenkova, she dropped down 11 spots to number 44 in the world, which means that she dropped out of being seeded at the US Open, which is not great for her. So, some familiar names there, losing points this week in Cincinnati. Over on the men's side of things, we had Menchik. He went up 1 spot to number 16 in the world, which is a career high for him. So he continues to slowly go up the rankings and will be really fun to watch him at the US Open, hopefully do well. Fonseca, he goes into the top 50, into that number 44 spot, 8 spots higher than last week, so a career high for him as well. And Atman, after having a great week, making the semifinals in Cincinnati, he goes up to number 69 in the world, which is 67 spots higher than last week. So 3 players there, 3 young players getting career high rankings this week. Players that dropped down in the rankings, Rublev, he goes down 4 spots to 15 in the world after losing points in Cincinnati, even though he had a really good result. He still lost points. Popyrin, he drops down 3 spots, number 36, which means he won't be seeded at the US Open at this stage unless some players ahead of him withdraw. So, really costly loss of points for Popyrin. And Hurkacz, he drops 12 spots, number 60 in the world, and of course isn't going to be playing in the future. So we don't know when he's coming back, and his ranking continues to drop. So, again, a lot of important drops in the rankings this week for some key guys. All right, let's have a look at the rankings this week because on the women's side of things, we had a very important change. No change at the top, though, because Sabalenka stays at number 1. But Swiatek, she overtakes Gauff to go to number 2, pushing Gauff down to number 3, which means Swiatek won't have to play Sabalenka until the final of the US Open, and possibly avoids Coco Gauff as well if Gauff does get drawn in Sabalenka's half. So, when the draw comes out in a couple of days, this could be a huge change in the rankings in favor of Swiatek, who over the last couple of months has just been getting back to her form. Pegula stayed at number 4 with Andreeva at 5, Keys at 6, and Zhang at number 7. Paolini, she goes up 1 spot to number 8, pushing Anisimova down to number 9. And Raducanu, she stays in the top 10 and rounds out the top 10 for this week. So, major change there. That Swiatek change is huge, but we'll wait until the draw comes out because, of course, it does depend where Coco falls and where some other players go in the draw to see whether or not being number 2 is really good and beneficial to Swiatek. Looking at the race to the finals, and still no change at the top with Sabalenka at 1, but Swiatek, she is now qualified for the WTA Finals based on points. After having a great week in Cincinnati winning the title, she stays at number 2, but she is now qualified and will be playing again at the end of the year finals. Gauff stays at 3 with Keys at 4, Andreeva at 5, and Anisimova at 6. But Raducanu, she goes up to number 7, pushing Pegula down to number 8 after making the semi-finals of Cincinnati. Paolini stays at number 9 even though she made the final. And Svitolina rounds out the top 10 for this week. So, really important change there and some really important points were on the line this week. But of course, the US Open, 2,000 points on the line for the champion. When we revisit the rankings in a couple of weeks, this list could look a little bit different. Over to the men's side of things now, and no change at the top with Sinner still at number 1 and Alcaraz at 2. Zverev at 3 and Fritz at 4. Draper stays at number 5 with Shelton at 6. Djokovic at 7 and Dimonov stays at 8. But Rune, he drops out of the top 10 completely, making way for Khachanov. He went up 3 spots into that number 9 spot, and Musetti stays at number 10. So, after a couple of good weeks, Khachanov is back in the top 10 and will be seated at that stage as well at the US Open. So, not only did he get a nice little boost back into the top 10, he's also going to be one of the highest seeds at the US Open and one of the single-digit seeds at the US Open and had a slam for the first time in a while. So nobody wants to see Khachanov right now. And he has made the semifinals of a US Open before, so very dangerous player indeed. But the gap up the top between Alcaraz and Sinner is slowly closing, with Sinner losing points from losing in the final of Cincy, and Alcaraz winning Cincinnati really changed things. So coming to the US Open, a lot of pressure on Sinner to try and maintain that gap between him and Alcaraz, because of course last year Sinner won the title and Alcaraz didn't do so well. So we might see some more changes, or at least some closer points after the US Open, depending on the results. Having a look at the race to the finals now, and still no change at the top, with Alcaraz and Sinner the only two players to qualify on points. Alcaraz extending his lead over Sinner in the race to the finals, of course, by winning the 1,000 points this week. Zverev stays at 3 with Shelton at 4. Djokovic at 5 with Fritz at 6. Draper stays at 7. De Minaur at 8. Musetti at 9. And Ruud rounds out the top 10. So no changes to the rankings this week, despite there being a lot of points on the line to go towards the race to the final points. So expect this to change, of course, at the US Open. There's 2,000 points for the winner and a lot of points behind that. So we should see some real changes here, and maybe even some players qualifying in the next couple of months or the next month or so, because after the US Open, there's not that many points still left, or not too many big tournaments left to gain points. So a lot of these players are going to start qualifying over the next couple of months, but US Open is going to be a big one to see who actually does take advantage of the last big trophy of the year. So there it is. They are the rankings. And of course, after these 1,000 events, there's a lot of things to talk about. Not too many changes, though. We didn't have too many changes to the rankings. On the women's side, we only had that really important change with Swiatek. But when the draw comes out, we'll see whether or not that actually does matter, because if Gauff and Swiatek get drawn in the same half, which 2 and 3 could play, and then Swiatek has to play someone like a Raducanu or an Ostapenko in the same part, then it doesn't really matter if she's number 2. But she avoids Sabalenka, and that's a big deal, because of course Sabalenka is the defending champion. And on the men's side, it's really just about how far, Alcaraz and Sinner are apart in the rankings, and if Sinner is going to stay that far apart against Alcaraz, or can Alcaraz close the gap? Because of course Sinner has a lot of points to defend throughout the rest of the season. He's got the US Open, he's got Shanghai coming up as well after this, and then of course Paris indoors, which he didn't do great at, or he didn't play last year, so he has some points to gain. But then the ATP Finals, Sinner won that last year, so there's a lot of upside for Alcaraz over the next couple of months if he plays well. But let me know in the comments below, what was the most memorable part of Cincinnati for you? Did you like the event? I know there's obviously talks about them being 2-week events. I don't think many of the fans like these events. Unless you enter the tournament, you probably love it because you get extra days. But there it is. That is the rankings for this week, and the US Open is starting soon.